A couple of months ago, I was in the waiting room in one of our schools that we go into, and I was waiting for my appointment with the principal. It was an appointment that I had made myself because there was no really communication between myself and this principal as far as phone conversations or text messages go. So I was just basically showed up and I gave myself an appointment and I was waiting. And I noticed that the school's mascot that they had for years was just basically a fish in an aquarium in this little entrance area, had died. And I whatever, I was just like, it was taken aback by it because it was like it was the fish, like everybody knew about the fish and it was just like part of that school. In the meeting I had with the principal, we were asked not to come back into the school, and I basically was just trying to figure out why. There, like openly and asking questions why, because we had had a very good presence in the school, and the kids liked us a lot, and we had been involved in many of the activities with them, not only curricular but also like extracurricular. And we had a really good rapport with the religion teachers and some of the other staff, the vice principal. It was just a really great vibe that we had. It was probably one of our second most visited schools. And it was, apparently it was all going back to an incident that had happened in one of the confessions where one of the confessors wasn't happy with the examination of conscience and the questions that were being asked in the confessional. It was an examination of conscience that we had had publicly to everybody, going over the sins. And then when it came to the sins of impurity, living in a relationship, that kind of sparked discontent, and that person went and said it to the principal and then got another person, and then the other person also said that they had a similar experience, and that was just too much, and it was kind of ruining the whole experience that this school had had with confession up until that moment. And that was the reason that we were asked, it's better not to come back to the school. It comes up in today's gospel as well. Today's gospel is the gospel of the possessed man, the Gerasene possessed man who's possessed by an unclean spirit, an impure spirit. And this guy's raving. He's off his head. In Luke's gospel, he's completely naked, and people can't do anything about him. He breaks the chains that they try to put on him. He shatters the shackles, as Mark says today. He shatters the shackles. Fulton Sheen says he is a clear case of the presence of the diabolic. Sheen says, if you want to know that there's a presence of the diabolic without seeing like a naked guy running around or screaming his head off, we could see a normal person. If you see, there's three characteristics that usually stand out in a diabolic possession or obsession, which we're probably more used to. The love of nudity. So if there's an attraction towards nudity, it could even be an addiction to pornography or to seeing nakedness, a love of nudity, of an obsession of nudity, violence, which could also be in the way of their speaking, but usually also physical violence, a love for violence, self-harm. This guy was beating himself with rocks and naked. And personality disorder, not like a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar, but identity crisis in the sense that you don't know who you are, and you're just basically a chameleon changing identities constantly. This guy says, I, in the singular, am many, in the plural. I am many. There's a problem there of identity. He doesn't have an identity. But what's really shocking about the gospel is that the people beg him to leave their district. They're terrified seeing this guy sitting down in his right mind, dressed, speaking with Jesus. It's an absolutely like extraordinary, beautiful scene of how when Jesus shows up and he casts out the demon, he stomps down and puts his hand down on the situation, and he takes control. The guy's sitting in his right mind, so he has his identity. He's dressed, and he's listening to the master. So it's beautiful. They're terrified, and they ask him to leave their district. And Jesus has to leave. He has to get back in the boat, and he has to leave their district. So when the apostle, and this is us, when we come into mission territory, we're going to be replacing something. our own bishop described us as kind of like a torpedo that goes into the water, and the torpedo replaces water because he's moving through and he's displacing things, and he's going towards his target, which is, there's going to be an explosion at the end, which is also an interesting. He didn't explain the last part, but like the perverse part he said was like, we're replacing something that's here. There's something established, and we're going in our way, which is a very hard mission, and we're replacing. So in our case, we're here working with the youth, and we want to replace a diabolic, a satanic grip that he has on the youth. We were at a match on Saturday, and it was like all these characteristics were coming together, and for me, the climax was seeing this young 14-year-old lad with his face painted red and black, being like dragged through the crowd by two security guards because he couldn't walk, and they'd found him passed out. They went up into the crowd because they had flares, and they're up there with like this crowd of lads that were screaming their heads off, and it did get a bit violent as well because their team was losing, and they're like, even their language is just getting really violent. They were throwing flares at people. It was just like, it was a mess. And they find him, he's passed out on the ground. And surprisingly enough, he wasn't getting trampled. And the other lads didn't even really, I don't know, they just left him there. So they dragged him out, and he's sitting there, and he's foaming at the mouth. His eyes are like rolling back in his head. He wasn't possessed, but like he was off his head on something. There must have been something that he had taken, and he's just throwing up on himself. Like the whole scene, the whole situation was like kind of, it was hard to watch. But it's just this image that this is what we're here for. We're here to be replacing something bad, a love of nudity and violence and an identity crisis, and we're replacing it with Christ. That's what we're doing. And it is going to get people offset because people like the way things are. These swine herders had their swine. They had their way of life. An inconvenience was this naked guy running around screaming that they couldn't control. But like, look, we are going to have to kind of just put up with it because, well, when this guy comes in to cure him, something's replaced and like thrown off balance. In this case, they lost their swine. Maybe in the case of like a principal, they're going to lose a bit of their rapport with the parents, or something could be thrown off of, okay, yeah, the priest is he's trying to get them to talk about like sexual sin, something's wrong here. It's like, so you'd rather have a nice confession where that stuff doesn't come out. We can just maintain the order, even though these girls could be self-harming. There could be massive problems at home. But like, as long as that's not really surfacing in my area, my little district. And they asked him to leave. He had to leave. And it is tremendous, and it is sad, but that's what we're coming up against, and that's what we're facing. And that's part of our mission. We're going to be coming up against, as one priest described it, the protectors and the guardians of the youth, these swine herders they're protecting the youth from Christ. And if anything comes out, or if anything's thrown off balance, the alarms start going off, and he's out. He has to leave. And they take back over, the control they had, and the missionary's not in there anymore. And they can continue on. They can carry on. So that's why we have to beg and ask the Lord for inspiration and protection, because it's a tough mission. We're going up against diabolical forces. The devil's real. He's nasty. He's terrifying, and he does have some power. So that's where we're going against. So we have to always enter in humble and small, and in our right minds as well, sitting at the feet of Christ and asking him to teach us and to inspire us so that we can go in and we can take back and conquer what is his, which is his young people, it's his youth. Amen.